At 7:30 a.m. on May 8,
The Battle of the Coral Sea
1942,
dived down through piercing anti-aircraft fire and sank.
a 27-year-old Navy pilot named Stanley Swede Vaitasa climbed into his SBD Dauntless on the deck of USS Yorktown. Above the Coral Sea, Japanese carriers had launched a full strike. Zero fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, the best air arm in the Pacific. Vaitasa was not in a fighter. His Dauntless was a slow, heavy dive bomber, built to attack ships, not dual aces. Every number was against him. The Zero was faster, turned tighter, climbed harder, and had a kill ratio that seemed untouchable. And yet, in the next few minutes, Vaitasa would do something no manual prepared him for, and no one believed possible. If you want more forgotten World War II stories like this, make sure you subscribe. In early May 1942, the Pacific hung in a razor-thin balance. Japan was pushing south toward Port Moresby, and the only force standing in their way was a battered U.S. carrier group built around USS Yorktown and USS Lexington. Carrier warfare was still new, unpredictable, and brutally unforgiving. Every aircraft mattered, every pilot mattered, and every mistake carried a price in steel and fire. Yorktown entered the morning of May 8th already weakened. Her strike group had launched the day before, hammering the Japanese light carrier Shoho and sending her to the bottom. Those planes were now returning low on fuel and badly needed aboard for refueling and rearming. That meant Yorktown had a dangerous, temporary vulnerability. She was nearly blind and nearly defenseless at the exact moment a major Japanese counterstrike was forming on radar. On paper, the carrier had fighter protection, 18 F-4F Wildcats. In reality, only 9 were airborne, scattered in combat air patrol. The remaining 9 were warming on deck in case of emergency, but not nearly enough to intercept a full Japanese strike group. And radar was already showing trouble. Dozens of Japanese aircraft were inbound. Fighters, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, each one capable of sinking a carrier on its own. That's when Captain Frederick Sherman of Lexington came up with a desperate idea. If they didn't have enough fighters, maybe they could pretend they did. He ordered SBD Dauntless dive bombers, slow, heavy, never designed for dogfights, into the sky as a low-altitude anti-torpedo patrol. Their job was simple in theory: use their forward .50 caliber guns and their rear seat gunners to disrupt Japanese torpedo planes before they reached firing position. This tactic had never been tested in real combat. It existed only in theory, a footnote in a training manual. No one knew if a dive bomber could survive a torpedo plane interception, much less what would happen if Japanese Zero fighters found them first. One of the pilots stepping into this unorthodox role was 27-year-old Stanley Swede Vaitasa, an SBD pilot with 5 months of combat time and a reputation for aggression. That morning, he launched not as a bomber, not as a scout, but as a placeholder fighter in a battle that was quickly spinning toward disaster. And he had no idea how many Japanese aircraft were already on their way. Vaitasa and 7 other SBD pilots settled into their low-altitude patrol, circling in a quiet tension that every carrier aviator knew too well. The calm before the sky erupted. Their orders were clear: watch for torpedo planes, dive on them before they could line up an attack, and hold the line until the Wildcats could regroup. None of them said the obvious. If Zeros appeared first, the patrol would become a slaughter. Then the first cracks in the defense appeared. Fighter direction officers aboard Yorktown had misread the incoming raid, assuming the Japanese would strike low with torpedo planes. They vectored the Wildcats downward, pulling them out of position. But the Japanese strike wasn't low. It was high, around 10,000 feet, and the fighters never intercepted. Within minutes, the Dauntless patrol became the only thing between the carriers and the incoming storm. Vaitasa saw them before anyone else, a dark swarm spilling out of scattered cloud cover. At least 50 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and 8 Zero fighters peeling away from the formation, angling straight toward his 4-plane section. 4 slow, heavy SBDS versus 8 of the most maneuverable fighters in the world. The mismatch was laughable on paper. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and out-accelerate the Dauntless in every imaginable way. In the first 6 months of the war, Zero pilots had achieved a 12-to-1 kill ratio. No American pilot volunteered to fight a Zero in a fair duel, let alone in a dive bomber loaded with fuel and ammunition. But Vaitasa carried something the Zero pilots weren't expecting, an unconventional rule drilled into him during training. Most targets under attack instinctively turned away, running for safety. But turning away gave a Zero the perfect firing solution. Predictable angle, steady movement, easy kill. Vaitasa had been taught to do the opposite. Turn into the attack. Force closure speeds so high the attacker has milliseconds to fire. Make yourself an impossible target. The tactic was considered borderline suicidal, but against 8 Zeros, he had no other option. The moment tracers ripped past his canopy, Vaitasa shoved the stick forward and hauled his Dauntless into a violent turn directly into the oncoming fighter. The first Zero overshot, unable to adjust in time. Then another dove in, and Vaitasa repeated the maneuver. Again and again, the Zero pilots were forced to choose between collision or breaking away. Behind him, his rear gunner poured out fire, filling the air with arcs of tracers that disrupted every coordinated attack. Then came the impossible. Vaitasa caught a Zero head-on, lined up for a fraction of a second, and fired. The fighter erupted into smoke. Moments later, a second Zero fell. Then a third. In a dive bomber that wasn't supposed to survive even one Zero attack, even after the shock of downing 3 Zeros, Vaitasa had no time to breathe. Beyond the dogfight, the real threat was still coming. The Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo planes streaking low toward the American carriers. These aircraft had already sunk British capital ships, already torn apart ships at Pearl Harbor, and now they were lining up on Lexington and Yorktown with deadly precision. The SBD patrol dove from altitude, trying to intercept, but it was too late. The Kates were already committed, flying through her flight deck, exploding deep inside the ship and triggering fires that raced through compartments. By the time Vaitasa spotted Yorktown again, smoke curled off both carriers. His own plane flew wounded, glass shattered, fuselage holed, control surfaces stiff from damage. But the engine held. He coaxed the battered Dauntless back. The U.S. had lost Lexington. And amidst it all, pilots like Vaitasa, pilots who refused to die when the odds demanded it, suddenly became the most valuable asset in the Pacific. Coral Sea changed everything for Vaitasa. Word spread quickly across the Pacific. A dive bomber pilot had outflown Zeros and shot down 3 in a single engagement. Something no one believed was even possible. The myth of the invincible Zero had already begun to crack at Midway, but Vaitasa's performance proved something new. Skill and mindset could overcome even the worst hardware disadvantage. And the Navy took notice. Fighter pilots were now the most scarce and most essential resource in the Pacific. Losses had been staggering since Pearl Harbor, and with carrier warfare evolving faster than doctrine could keep up, the Navy needed men who had already survived the unthinkable. Veitasa received new orders. He was being transferred from dive bombers to fighters, joining one of the most aggressive squadrons in the fleet, VF-10, the Grim Reapers. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander James "Jimmy" Flatley, a pilot already known for refusing to accept the Zero as unbeatable. Flatley had fought them, studied them, teamwork into everything. Paired fighting, mutual support, coordinated slashing attacks. This was also the era when John Thatch's beam defense, later called the Thatch Weave, began proving itself. Two Wildcats would fly side by side. When a Zero latched onto one, the fighters turned toward each other, forcing the attacker into the crossfire. It was elegant, simple, and deadly. Veitasa didn't just absorb these ideas, he challenged them. He pushed Flatley for more offensive tactics, incorporating altitude, energy, and aggressive speed-building dives. VF-10 became a tactical laboratory built around pilots who had survived close-quarters combat with Japan's best. By the time the squadron boarded USS Enterprise, Veitasa was no longer the dive bomber who got lucky. He was a fighter pilot. Sharpened, respected, Soryu and Hiryu were lost along with the elite aviators who had dominated the skies since 1941. Japan's striking arm was wounded, but not finished. The fight shifted south, to the jungles and reefs of Guadalcanal, where the U.S. clung to Henderson Field in a struggle decided almost daily by whichever side could put aircraft over the island. Carriers became priceless. Lexington was gone. Saratoga had been torpedoed. Yorktown limped into Midway repairs and never returned from the battle. That left the Pacific Fleet. Disaster nearly struck from within. On October 25, 1942, the day before Santa Cruz, Admiral Kincaid ordered a massive search flight to locate the approaching Japanese fleet. The problem? The search vectors were wrong, pointed toward empty water, and the launch came so late that the returning aircraft would be forced to find Enterprise in darkness, with low fuel and under strict radio silence. It was a near-suicidal order. As night fell, pilots scattered across hundreds of miles searched desperately for their carrier. Fuel gauges touched empty. Some ditched at sea. Others circled blindly. One small clue saved the survivors. It meant only one thing: both sides would strike at the same time. Whoever survived the first wave would control the day. Veitasa was already airborne on combat air patrol, circling above the task force. Below him, the carriers maneuvered wildly, zigzagging at high speed. On radar screens aboard Enterprise, multiple Japanese formations appeared: dive bombers at altitude, torpedo planes skimming the waves, Zero fighters escorting them in layered swarms. The fighter direction chaos began instantly. Radios overlapped, orders contradicted each other, and the thin line of defending Wildcats found themselves scattered across the sky. The first blow fell on Hornet. His shots tore into the lead bomber's engine, sending it spinning into the ocean before it could release its payload. He raked another as it dove, damaging it, but not enough to stop it. The surviving Vals struck Hornet with brutal precision. A 250-kilogram bomb blasted through her deck. A burning Val, possibly the very one Veitasa hit, smashed into her island structure, spraying flaming fuel across the bridge. Then the torpedo planes arrived. Two struck Hornet's starboard side in rapid succession. Within minutes, the carrier lost power. Flames rolled across her decks. Smoke poured from ruptured compartments. She was dead in the water. But the Japanese weren't finished. More dive bombers followed, hammering the motionless ship until she was little more than a floating inferno. From the sky, Veitasa saw the truth. Hornet was doomed. That left one carrier, Enterprise, as the only operational U.S. fleet carrier left in the entire Pacific. And the next wave was already coming for her. The second Japanese attack wave appeared on Enterprise's radar just after 9:30 a.m. A larger, more coordinated strike than the one that had mortally wounded Hornet. This time, the spear point wasn't dive bombers, it was torpedo planes. 11 Nakajima B-5N Kates were racing in low and fast, coming from multiple directions to trap the last American carrier in a kill box. If Enterprise turned to dodge one spread of torpedoes, she would roll straight into another. It was a textbook Japanese torpedo assault, deadly, disciplined, and designed to sink a ship twice her size. Vaitasa saw them forming up below him, sleek silhouettes just above the wavetops, their torpedoes glinting in the morning sun. He pushed his Wildcat over into a steep diving attack. Gravity became his weapon. The Wildcat wasn't as fast as a Zero, but in a dive, with its rugged frame and heavy guns, it was a predator. He hit the first Kate at jettisoning torpedoes early, their carefully timed run collapsing under the sudden violence of a single American fighter ripping into their flank. Vaitasa stayed on them. He lined up on a second Kate and shredded it. He rolled into a third. More rounds, more fire, another kill. Rear gunners from the torpedo planes peppered his Wildcat with return fire, punching holes through metal. But the aircraft held together. A fourth Kate fell, then a fifth. Combined with the two Valdive bombers he had shot down earlier in the same mission, the tally reached 7 enemy aircraft, destroyed in under half an hour. Below him, Enterprise twisted through white trails of torpedo wakes. The Japanese attack, one that should have sunk her, was falling apart. The planes that survived Vaitasa's assault released torpedoes at sloppy angles or too far out to arm, splashing uselessly into the sea. Bomb hits still struck Enterprise that morning, but the torpedo attack, the one blow she could not have survived, was broken. 1 pilot. 1 Wildcat. 7 kills in one mission. And a carrier saved from the bottom of the Pacific. When the sky finally went quiet over the Santa Cruz Islands, Enterprise's flight deck looked like a scarred battlefield. Bomb craters, smoke-stained catwalks, shattered railings. Pilots staggered back into the ready rooms, exhausted, uniforms soaked with sweat and cordite, ears still ringing from the scream of engines and anti-aircraft bursts. Ground crews pushed shot-up Wildcats aside like broken shields. Everyone was alive on pure adrenaline and disbelief. And then the stories began circulating. Someone had seen Vaitasa's Wildcat trailing smoke. Someone else had counted the kills he'd radioed in. Rear gunners on other aircraft swore they'd watched him carve through the torpedo formation like a man possessed. By the time Vaitasa climbed down from his cockpit, word was already spreading across the deck. He had saved the carrier. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley, his commanding officer, mentor, and fellow Coral Sea veteran, read the combat reports and didn't hesitate. He entered a line in Vaitasa's flight log that became legend in naval aviation. Greatest single combat flight in the history of the U.S. Navy. Flatley immediately began drafting the paperwork for the Medal of Honor. He compared Vaitasa's performance directly to Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare's famous 5-kill mission, a mission that did earn O'Hare the Medal of Honor. Vaitasa had shot down 7, under worse odds, in defense of the last functioning American carrier in the Pacific. But the nomination hit a political wall. Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commander of Task Force 61, was under scrutiny. Hornet was gone. Enterprise was damaged. Fighter direction had been chaotic, and the disastrous mislaunched search mission the day before had nearly doomed the entire air group. A Medal of Honor would draw reporters, investigators, uncomfortable questions. Why were 8 Wildcats forced to defend 2 carriers from 60 enemy aircraft? Why had the air group been sent off course and nearly lost at sea? Why had fighter control failed so badly? Kincaid made a decision, quietly, without debate. The highest nomination in naval aviation was downgraded. Instead of the Medal of Honor, Veitasa received the Navy Cross, his third. Among the pilots of VF-10, the downgrade hit like a punch. Every man in the squadron knew what he'd done. So did history. But Veitasa never complained. Not once. After Santa Cruz, the Navy pulled Veitasa out of frontline combat, not because he faltered, but because pilots like him had become irreplaceable. In early 1943, he was brought stateside to train the next generation of naval aviators. Young men, many barely out of high school, sat in classrooms and cockpits absorbing lessons that Veitasa had learned through fire. How to fight the Zero, how to survive a dogfight you shouldn't win, how to use instinct when everything else fails. His official tally ended at 10 and 1/4 confirmed victories. But every pilot he trained carried pieces of his experience into battles he would never see. The war rolled on. The Navy grew stronger. New carriers replaced the ones lost at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. New fighters, Hellcats and Corsairs, arrived with armor, speed, and firepower built on the blood-won insights of 1942. Veitasa watched from stateside airfields, shaping men who would fly them. Many came home, some didn't. He carried all of them with him. His post-war career stretched over decades. He commanded fighter squadrons. He served as air officer aboard USS Essex during the Korean War, coordinating strikes against enemy positions with the same precision that once guided his Wildcat through swarms of Japanese aircraft. He climbed through the ranks with a reputation for discipline, preparation, and absolute calm under pressure. In 1962, he took command of the supercarrier USS Constellation, a floating city, a symbol of American power, and an irony he never missed. 2 decades earlier, he fought to keep one carrier alive. Now he commanded a ship 10 times more capable. He retired in 1970 as a captain, chest full of ribbons, 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Bronze Stars, a Legion of Merit, and more. But not the Medal of Honor. The question never left him, yet he never chased the answer. He never wrote letters, never petitioned, never spoke bitterness into interviews. When journalists pushed, he talked instead about the men who didn't make it home, about Jimmy Flatley. Politics stopped it. Stanley "Swede" Veitasa died in 2013 at 98 years old. Per his request, his ashes were scattered at sea, the same vast ocean that once held the smoke of burning carriers, the flashes of tracer fire, and the impossible dogfights that defined his youth. The Navy gave him medals. History gave him something greater. A legacy that refuses to fade. A reminder that sometimes the highest honors aren't pinned to a uniform. They're written in the stories we refuse to let die.